Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, everyone, depending where you are in the world. My name is Sandro Galea. I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. On behalf of our school, welcome. Before we begin, a word of thanks to all who helped make today happen. In particular, thank you to the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice for co-hosting this event annually. Thank you to the ICPH core instructors and our school's DEIJ committee for selecting our annual SPH Reads book and incorporating its themes into the semester. And to our Office of Graduate Student Life for ensuring all members of our community could read the book, which will inform a semester of conversation. This is part of a series of public health conversations that are intended as spaces where we come together for the conversations to create a healthier world. Conversations for expert speakers to engage, debate, and sharpen our thinking towards a deeper understanding of the issues that shape health. This is a special public health conversation. It is our 7th annual SPH Reads conversation. SPH Reads is a program that brings our community together, selecting one book each academic year for us all to read, and we carry these themes throughout the year. This year, we have selected The Fortune Man, and we are delighted to be hosting a conversation with the author, Nadifa Mohamed. I read The Fortune Man more than a year ago now and was captivated by the story it told, by the humanity of the people involved, by how well the book took concepts that can seem abstract, like structural racism, and show us, without pedantry, how they matter to all our day-to-day lives. I was particularly struck by how well the story portrayed an imperfect character at its center, and yet one who faced enormous injustice with so many echoes that remain relevant today. I'm really delighted to be hearing from the author to learn more about this book. Welcome. I'm now going to turn the event over to our moderator, Dean Yvette Cozier, our Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice at the school. Yvette, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Dean Galea. We are delighted to introduce author Nadifa Mohamed. Her book, The Fortune Man, tells the true, harrowing story of Mahmood Mattan, a young Somali sailor living in Cardiff, Wales, who in 1952 was wrongfully convicted and subsequently executed for murder. In this book, Ms. Mohamed explores themes of racial prejudices, the criminal justice system, and social economic status, which tells a compelling story that is still relevant to life today. The Fortune Man is a finalist for the prestigious Booker Award. And in addition to this book, Ms. Mohamed has written Black Mamba Boy and The Orchard of Lost Souls. Ms. Mohamed's writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and many other publications. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Ms. Mohamed, and we look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you for being here. So to start, can you tell us a little bit about the title of your book, The Fortune Man?
Sure. So The Fortune Man was the title that came to me very late, actually. This novel has gone through lots of different titles, but this has a connection to Black Mamba Boy, my first novel, which you just mentioned. And it was a term that my father told me about. My father was a sailor who knew Mahmood Mattan, the subject of The Fortune Man. And my father had become a sailor in the late 1940s after this really arduous journey from what was then British Somaliland to Egypt. And when he finally had his passport and was ready to join his first ship, the other Somali young men described him and the others on that journey as fortune men. So it had a double meaning, I think, really to them. Partly, you are now able to make a fortune. So on a few journeys at sea, they would be able to earn more money than they ever would back in East Africa. But also they were men who were putting their lives in the hands of fortune, into the hands of fate. This is just after the Second World War, where a huge number of merchant marines, sailors had been lost. Something like 25% of sailors were lost at sea during the Second World War. And the ones that didn't die, they would be never heard from again. They would marry someone somewhere and establish a new life, and that was that. So it was very much a way of life where you took your chance, you took your luck.
Okay, wow, thank you. So when did you first learn about Mahmood Mattan, and why was his story so compelling?
It was instantly compelling, and in hindsight, I think lots of different things made it compelling to me. I first read about him in 2004 or 5 when I was an intern working for a film company as a researcher, my first job after university, and I was meant to be just doing the boring research things, which were not so boring after all. But I remember looking at this Daily Mail newspaper, a really awful British tabloid, but they would have these very in-depth looks at historical stories. And Mahmood's face was there, his mugshot from the prison. And I just thought, why was this young man, who was the same age as my father, in Britain at that time, in jail at that time? And why did this terrible thing that happened happen to him in particular? And I found out pretty quickly after that my father had known him. They'd spent some time together in Hull, where my father was based as a sailor, and where Mahmood moved with his Welsh wife, Laura, for a few years to get away from Cardiff. So their lives had crossed, and then my father had decided to go to sea, and he was at sea for a year and a half when all of this was going on. And by the time my father had returned to Britain, Mahmood had been hanged.
Wow, it's. I didn't realize that how much of the overlap with your father and Mahmood Mattan. So a couple of things. One is the book takes place 70 years ago, and really at the beginning of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, who has now ended, her reign has ended. For those who haven't read the book, can you share a passage with us?
Sure.
Focusing on that?
Yep. This is the British paperback.
Okay.
So yeah, it's big news here. It's quite a shock, even for me. I think we'd all got used to seeing the Queen as this immovable object in the nation, who'd be there through everything and had been there through everything, most recently during the COVID pandemic and Brexit and all of this chaos that seems to be constantly going on. And despite the fact that she was 96, I think we all feel this feeling of shock. And I'm particularly attached to her because of The Fortune Men, and the novel and the research for the novel allowed me to understand her, or to know at least a little bit of her story as a 25-year-old princess who came to the throne very unexpectedly. Her father died young. She wasn't even meant to be in the royal line. It was because her uncle had abdicated that she became an heir to the throne, and then at the age of 25 she became queen. So this is the moment where the locals in Tiger Bay find out what's happened. The king is dead. Long live the queen. The announcer's voice crackles from the wireless and winds around the rapt patrons of Berlin's milk bar as sinuously as the fog curls around the mournful street lamps, their wan glow barely illuminating the cobblestones. The noise settles as milkshakes and colas clink against Irish coffees and chairs scrape against the black and white tiled floor. Berlin hammers a spoon against the bar and calls out with his lion tamer's bark, "Raise your glasses, ladies and gentlemen, and send off our old king to Davy Jones's locker." "He'll meet many of our men down there," replies old Ismail. "He better write his apologies on the way down." "I bet he wrote them on his deathbed," the punter cackles. Through the rock and roll and spitting espresso machine, Berlin hears someone calling his name. "Mahatiri," he asks, as Mahmood Mattan pushes through the crowd. "I said, get me another coffee." Berlin catches his Trinidadian's wife's waist and steers her towards Mahmood. "Lou, sort this troublemaker out, another coffee." Ranged along the bar are many of Tiger Bay's Somali sailors. They look somewhere between gangsters and dandies in their cravats, pocket chains and shawby hats. Only Mahmood wears a Homburg pulled down low over his gaunt face and sad eyes. He is a quiet man, always appearing and disappearing silently at the fringes of the sailors or the gamblers or the thieves. Men pull their possessions closer when he is around and keep their eyes on his long, elegant fingers. But Tahir Gas, who was only recently released from Whitchurch Asylum, leans close to him, looking for friendship that Mahmood won't give. Tahir is on a road no one can or will walk down with him, his limbs spasming from invisible electric shocks, his face a cinema screen of wild expressions.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's, yeah, it's wonderful to hear you read that. Many things come to mind here. So one is really just the palette of and the environment of Tiger Bay. I think some of us in the US don't ascribe the multiculturalism that exists in other parts of the world, and particularly at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about that place and why it was so
Sure.
culturally complex?
Yes, it was a strange place. Cardiff had gone from being a very small town to being a very important port. At one point, it was even busier than New York's port, because of coal. The whole industry was based on coal. So coal fields were found across South Wales of good quality. And the Industrial Revolution that had happened in the 18th and 19th century in Britain was fueled by a lot of this coal, and its steamships and its railways was fueled by this coal. So it was very much an imperial center. And part of that was bringing men from this empire, from Yemen, from Somaliland, from the Caribbean, China, India. All of these people ended up building this Creole culture in Cardiff. And black sailors went there thinking this is somewhere that they've heard about. This is a notorious place, an exciting place. It gave birth to this culture that was part Muslim, part Christian, part Jewish, part Orthodox. It had the Maltese there. So it wasn't just, it was, I think, in the same way that New York was developing into a place for everyone, Cardiff was a small microcosm of that. So when my father arrived in Britain, it was also through Wales. He arrived in Port Talbot, which was an even smaller port town there, where his ship, which had been carrying Jewish refugees from Palestine as it was then, back to Europe, they were forced off in Germany and put into displaced people's camps in Germany. And afterwards, this ship, the Runnymede Park, brought my father to Britain. And that was his first site, was actually Port Talbot, Wales. So Wales was an outward porous border for the UK. And at the same time, it has a very particular identity of its own, of being a Welsh-speaking and nationalistic place in opposition to England, which has been the colonizer for centuries. It's a place where there's a strong working class culture. Much later on, Paul Robeson would visit Cardiff and places in South Wales and North Wales and have a rapturous welcome. So it was a very funny place, mixed but not mixed, welcoming but not really welcoming, and it's like that to this day.
It's interesting, mixed but not mixed, and that's a sense that you get through the book. You see again this very multicultural palette, but you could tell that some of these alliances were uneasy, particularly with the locals, who seemed to, on one hand, I guess the reality is many of these immigrants were invited here. They were invited to be part of the economy because it was necessary, for the workforce. But then once there, that did not work out quite as well. One of the descriptions of your book that I love is that, and I'll read it, is Mahmood Mattan is a fixture in Cardiff's Tiger Bay, 1952, which bustles with Somali and West Indian sailors, Maltese businessmen, and Jewish families. So I love that grouping together. I'd like to focus a little bit on the central character, Mahmood Mattan, in that reading, he's, everyone is sort of rejoicing. He's, kind of slinking along the sides. And even those where he's coming to sort of get community or maybe just a drink are a little wary of him. Can you talk about him as a character? Because he sometimes is not that sympathetic, right, as a character.
Yes. So the fictional Mahmood, the novel's Mahmood, is somewhere between the archival record, the familial record that Laura and his children left behind, the remembrances of people that I interviewed, one of them being Ismail Isa, a very elderly Somali sailor who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, who knew him, who had been with Mahmood on his wedding day and then had gone to sea with him for 8 months. Of Olabisi Ocean, who was a Nigerian watchmaker who had had a fight with Mahmood in the streets because he thought that Mahmood had stolen a watch from him. And Olabisi had been kind of press ganged by the police into being one of the prosecution witnesses. So you have this varied, you have these varied perspectives on Mahmood. Some of pure love and of, the horror of losing him, and others of, there's a peer relationship. These young men, Black young men, who sometimes fought, sometimes got along, sometimes judged each other in various ways. And then, of course, there's what I bring to the narrative and how I imagine him. And part of that's informed by my own father and what I know of my own father and particularly his early life. And also my own experiences of being an immigrant to the UK. I was much younger when I arrived. I was 4 years old. But some of those experiences that he would have had in the 1950s, I think I've had, of suspicion of people looking as if you might steal from them, all of that, the kind of very typical experiences of being Black across the world. So there's some of me in there, and I guess probably some of my own reactions. What I find particularly interesting about Mahmood was the fact that he wasn't afraid. I think it was quite an unusual time for someone to say to the police, "You're liars. Everything you say is a lie. Why are you trying to pin it on a Black man?" That's the first response that he has when the police come knocking on the night of the murder. And I know exactly why he's saying that and thinking that, but the idea of a young man in the 1950s with all of the vulnerability that involves, being that bold with the police, that made him interesting to me. And that wasn't something I found out, for the 17 years I was thinking about this project and working on it. I only found out about this side of him much later when the archives were opened. So thankfully the case file was opened early, and the Mahmood that you find there is very prickly. The police don't like him, it's very obvious. But some of the things he says, in the newspaper accounts, in the court transcript, you just think, oh my God, Mahmood, be quiet, be quiet. Stop, someone needs to rein him in. But that's also what makes him exciting, is that he refused to be reined in. No, exactly. He didn't seem to always help his own case many times. But, you mentioned, the police didn't like him. And one could, he was a prickly person, but, also the idea of race and racism in this. And, perhaps I should back up a little bit for those who might not, have been totally familiar with the book. It centers around this murder. And this Violet Volacki, that's the name, who was Lucy Volper. That's right. I go between the character and the actual, but it was obviously a real person died, and yet even she brings a different perspective as a Jewish woman in Cardiff at that time. Can you say a little bit about how her identity, her characteristics might have played into this miscarriage of justice as well? For sure. I think definitely the idea of her and of her family being good immigrants, the kind of immigrants that will eventually be welcomed into the cultural, social fabric of Cardiff, of the UK. Her family, her father arrived in Britain in 1905 a Jewish refugee from Russia, where they just introduced conscription. I think a lot of people were fleeing Russia, and also pogroms and violence of different descriptions. And he did the classical rise to riches. I think when he first arrived, he mended shoes, and then he opened a shop, and then opened another shop. So by the time we meet the Lackey family, as I've renamed them, they're not extravagantly wealthy at all, but they're doing well. And somehow, even as lone women, there's no man in the house. Lily, who is renamed Violet in the novel, is a spinster. She's never married, partly because she had a disability. She had scoliosis of the spine. So I think that, in combination with having this career of her own, meant she never married, apparently. But Diana, her sister, who in real life was called Doris, did marry, and her husband and her signed up in 1938 for the RAF before the outbreak of the Second World War, to fight Hitler, to defend the rights of Jewish people in Europe. And when the war did break out, he was sent to North Africa, where in 1941 his plane went missing. And after some months, he was declared dead, and she stayed with her sister and raised their daughter alone, as a single mum.
And just, I was just going to say, just for clarification, the RAF, Royal Air Force?
Air Force. Yes, yeah, so the Air Force of the UK. So an unusual family in many respects. Yes, they were upstanding, good immigrants, but there was also something else. There was, I think, the fact that Doris, to use her real name, Diana, in the novel, and her husband sacrificed their own lives in many respects to do something that they thought was for the greater good. There was also a strange story where their father, Marx, his name was, took his wife to court twice for a divorce, at the stage where divorce was very, very expensive to attempt, and also very shameful. So in the 1920s and 30s, he went to London to accuse her of adultery and try and win a divorce. And on the second time round, he was successful. So that also caught my eye. This family that had been quite quiet and quite private, the more I delved into their story, the more their own particularities became interesting to me. And it felt as if in these archives that I was visiting in Cardiff and in London, Diana's daughter had left these really tantalizing traces of their family history. And they became a bigger and bigger part of the novel. And one thing that I think really made me want to understand them was, despite the police pressure that there must have been to identify Mahmood as the killer, because Diana and her daughter had seen two men on the doorstep on the night of the murder. So they had probably seen the killer, but they refused to say that it was Mahmood. And if they had, that would have made the case even nicer and neater for the police. You know, there we have the witnesses, the relatives, and they're saying it was this man. Do what you need to do. But they refused. And that courage I found interesting. And it made me wonder about their own experiences as immigrants, as Jewish people in what was still a very anti-Semitic country, and how that maybe crossed this line that the society had been trying to create between someone like Mahmood and someone like them.
Yes, and you bring up a good point. So, again, about the good immigrant and the bad immigrant. And the police expressed disappointment in their inability to pick him out of a lineup. Like they were very disappointed in you. Go home and, rest.
Think about it again.
Think about this again. And so it again, both holding them up, but also, casting them aside very, very easily.
Yeah.
And I think another thought with them is just myself, and out of interest from this book, just, trying to see what I was able to find simply online, and every description of the victim really started to fall, into like a stereotypic trope. There's very little really written about it. First, she was a shopkeeper. And then at one description, she's a moneylender. And they have a description, you know, a pawnbroker even. So what can you say about that? You started to mention about sort of anti-Semitism in Wales at that time.
And in the UK as a whole.
Okay, yeah.
So in 1947, there were attacks on Jewish shops to do with what was going on in British Palestine and the triple, you know, attacks between British and Jewish groups and then Arab groups. So all of that was being imported back into the UK and creating anti-Semitic feeling, especially through the way that it was presented in the newspapers. So, and also they were there in 1919 when there had been race riots, which were mostly aimed at the Black and Asian population, but they lived there, their shop was there. And they were all foreigners. The Maltese were foreigners, the Greeks were foreigners. Just the idea of who was us and who was them was very much a narrow us. So anyone of a different religion, with tan skin, with curly hair, all of it was other, all of it was colored, all of it was inferior. So growing up in Tiger Bay, I'm sure that the Volpert Valaki family felt othered. And as they rose up economically, people would have assumed that they would leave, as other families did, and move to wealthier parts of the city or assimilate in various ways, but they hadn't. They hadn't. So maybe they felt welcome in that particular cosmopolitan atmosphere. And you're right, there is very little information on Violet. So she's described as a 41-year-old spinster, as a shopkeeper, as a moneylender, and all of this, you know, the fact that they worked in a community of seafarers, that was also specific. So she wasn't a moneylender in a traditional sense. She would cash advance notes of pay. So sailors would come and they would have this promise letter from their ship, and to get money in advance, they would then go to somewhere like the Valaki shop. She would give the cash, and in return, once they received their wages, she would receive their wages. So that also made the police think that this is all a bit suspicious, that maybe it's one of these sailors who she's advanced money to that's come back to attack her. But she was a very private woman, quite a nervous woman from the little I've been able to find out about her. One touching detail was that there were 5 locks on the door, which seemed kind of excessive to me up until I read that there'd been a string of attacks on the shop. And no one really knows what these were, if it was teenagers, you know, just pranking around, or if there were burglars interested in the shop. It took quite a lot of money for a shop in a very poor district. So maybe it did hold itself out as some sort of beacon. And whoever did kill Violet made, you know, they took money. They took £100, which was a substantial amount of money at that time.
Yeah, and right about the same time that Mahmood had a little bit of a win streak.
Yes.
One of his, you know, vices or habits was that he was a gambler.
Yeah.
So that kind of put him again in the crosshairs. You know, let's you know, talk a little bit about his family now, because that was a third piece that comes in there. He's married to a Welsh woman. They have 3 young sons, and why don't you describe that family unit?
Yeah, so they were kind of Romeo and Juliet, Dido and Aeneas. They were not meant to be together. She was 17 when they met, and he was just a few years older than her. And within 3 months of meeting on the street, he asked her to go to the cinema one day. She agreed, knowing that her family would be very much against it. And within 3 months, they were married. Wow. So that was a kind of social death for someone like Laura. You know, she was extremely poor from a very working class family, but the one thing that she had was her whiteness. And by marrying Mahmood, she kind of traded that in. She found herself in this place where she was not white, but she wasn't anything else either. And some of the other women who married the foreign men, they converted to Islam. They raised their children in that very specific community. But she didn't do that. So she stayed with her family in Adamsdown, in a more white working class district, And her and Mahmood had this kind of strange but very intense, loving relationship where at one point he moved in with the family, which was also extremely unusual. Then they went to Hull to try and live as a family together there. And then one day Mahmood said he came home from work and she'd gone and she'd taken the children and run back to Cardiff. So then he followed her back to Cardiff. And at some point they were legally separated, but living across the road from each other. And whenever I mention this, it recurs to me that they were so young.
Yeah.
He's 21, he's probably in his mid-20s, and they're just being erratic and trying to make this very difficult relationship work. I think they did love each other, and the minute Mahmood was in trouble, Laura came running to try and help him. So I think that the complications of having a mixed race relationship in a context where it was so taboo, and the lives of their children were then dominated by the fact that they were seen as the worst of both races. That was the mentality amongst many people, that mixed race children, heritage children picked up the worst of both parents. And the children were traumatized in many, many ways by being children of two parents from different backgrounds. And then of course of Mahmood having been executed as well. So that trauma is one that caught up with them throughout their lives, and one by one the sons died with alcoholism, homelessness as their chief problems.
Wow.
But that love affair that happened in 1947 is where it all began, and it could have changed. I always wondered what would happen, what would have happened if they had stayed in Hull, or if they had gone to Somaliland. Some women even went back to Somaliland or Aden with their husbands. So all of these paths, non-taken, untaken, led to this particular tragedy.
Yeah, and I love the phrase that you use, that she basically traded in her whiteness, traded in her privilege. And at one point, when she comes to visit him, she has, she's hiding a bruise from someone who, threw a rock at her, and makes disparaging remarks about her children and relationship. So. But they started out in love, but she really was kind of a portrait in courage. She was a big force in his redemption.
Tough.
Yeah,
very tough. And he was a rebel, and she was a rebel. And I think Diana, on the other side, was also a rebel, and maybe violent in the sense that she refused the pressure to be a married woman in very traditional patriarchal 1950s Britain. So these are all rebels, and Tiger Bay was a place where rebels came and lived and found shelter amongst each other. So there was quite a strong, obvious gay and queer community there, and they lived together. The couples, gay couples, lesbian couples, lived together, raised children together. Mixed race couples. It was a place for people who didn't fit in and couldn't fit in other places. But for Laura, she kind of kept a leg in and a leg out in both worlds, which was a very, very difficult way to live. It was a harder way to live. Some women, they would see the error in their ways and give up the children, leave the husband, and then start a whole new life where they could then reclaim their whiteness.
Yeah.
But she didn't do that. And it takes a particular courage to withstand social pressure of that level.
Yeah. And, of course, as the story goes on, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is, he's obviously arrested and imprisoned, and she continues to visit him, even bringing the boys. And a very touching scene is the prison is literally in the backyard of the house where she was living.
Yeah, over the street where they both lived.
So she would,
big, miserable Victorian prison. It looms over the whole street.
Yeah, so she could bring the boys out for him to look and see the family. So that's absolutely heartbreaking to be that close to your family, but not able to
And that sounds like a fictional detail, but that was actually the case.
That's the case.
She described, she did lots of interviews around the time of the appeal to clear Mahmoud's name, and she described waving to him, and he would wave with a handkerchief from his prison cell.
No.
And that was, again, one of those details that made me think, wow, this isn't a usual, typical story. There were all of these details that just made it more heart-wrenching.
Yeah. And I'd say one more thing about her. I was struck in that she said that he was like the best thing that happened to her, despite her trading her privilege. What can you say about that? I mean,
that's something she said later on in life.
Okay, later.
So, I guess, and that makes it more powerful because she's got her whole life to reflect on, and the cost of loving someone like him and what it did to her and did to the children. So for her to still say he was still the best thing that ever happened to me, he treated me like a queen, she said. And he raised her up. She was a working class woman, this kind of drudge, both socially and within her own family, where she did a lot of the household chores because she was the eldest daughter. So again, that relationship where she could identify with his Blackness, and maybe he could identify with her femininity, because these were both oppressed, suppressed identities in that culture. It was inferior to be a woman, it was inferior to be a Black man. So that was something where maybe there was a synergy. And, he came from quite an established middle-class background in Somaliland. He hadn't suffered in the way that my father had suffered in various ways as a child. So that he also brought a confidence, a swagger, a glamour to her life that she would have definitely lacked, I think, in most other relationships. He was exotic to her, she was exotic to him. And it created this connection. And I think one of the reasons, because Mahmoud in his last year of life was very different from the Mahmoud that I think had gone before. He's acting out, he's losing it in various ways. And this happened after they were separated. So for some reason, he needed her to give him stability. And when her and the children were not there in the same way in his life, he started committing petty crimes, gambling, drinking, floating around, moving from place to place. And, when I think about him, I think he's probably suffering from some sort of mental health issues at that point. And also the various microaggressions. We've got the term microaggressions, but they were macroaggressions in the 1950s of being Black in a country where there was a color bar, which was very similar to segregation in South Africa, in the Deep South. You could only live in certain places, only get particular jobs. You were degraded constantly, you were harassed by the police. And the one happiness maybe that he'd had was to build a life with Laura and their sons, and that had now been taken away from him. And that made me wonder then about the resentment he may have had towards Laura and her own fatigue. She's doing all of the work of being a mother to these three children day to day. So this mutual kind of hostility, but love at the center of it all. Yeah.
And again, one of the points in the book was that he had actually gone to the port of New Orleans on a ship and experienced even it seemed like even like a heavier form of racism.
Yeah,
more obvious, where a young girl could, basically, point and he'd have to carry their bag or so.
Yeah, and this is 2 years before what happened to Emmett Till happened to Emmett Till. This is a global climate that he's part of, but with different flavors. Yeah. So the British flavor was maybe a little bit more subdued than what you'd get in New Orleans. But the same belief in white supremacy was there. These were ideas that were formulated in Britain and its colonies, in America, in France and its colonies. It was standard. It was standard to believe that someone like Mahmoud should be paid less, that he was less intelligent, that he was more dangerous, that he would pollute the white race by having children with a white woman. So you could never really escape, which created then this parity. Even if he had stayed in Somaliland, there were parts of Hargeisa, his hometown, my hometown, which were the white neighborhoods, the white districts, where natives, as we were called, would not be allowed to live. And that was even more extreme across Kenya, South Africa, and other parts of the colonized world. So it was a question then of, where do I go? Where do I find any dignity if this is the overarching ethos everywhere that I go? And he found a small pocket in Tiger Bay where he could live a decentish life. My father did the opposite. He never put his roots down anywhere. He just kept roaming. And that was his way of dealing with what was going on. And I think Berlin thinks back to his own experiences early on in the novel. And he's met Tayage, who's a Mohawk from Canada. And he says that Tayage has found refuge in the air, working on steel girders in the building industry, while Berlin sought sanctuary in the sea, because the land didn't belong to them. Anywhere that they went, the land didn't belong to them. So that moment, that moment where the colonial people are becoming wiser and wiser and more resistant to this domination. We're 10 years away from most of the decolonizations across Africa, the independence movements in Africa. This is just where it's starting to begin. And Mahmood, in this very shapeless, apolitical form, is part of that. He's saying, why can't I do this? Laura, his wife, said in an interview much later on that she sometimes thought he forgot he was Black, which made me laugh. And I think I know what she means. He refused the role of what it meant to be Black.
Yeah.
He wasn't willing to be subjugated and to say, these are the parameters within which I must live.
Yeah, sort of that external definition of who he was.
Yeah.
It's that.
Yeah. You live there, you do this job, you keep your head down, you say, yes, sir, no, sir.
Yeah. So I want to move on to some questions, but before I do, I want to talk just a little bit about just the criminal justice system at the time. So again, as you read in your first passage, the story begins with the transfer of the monarchy. So from we're just thinking about the span of the reign of Elizabeth, what has changed and what has remained the same within the British system of either policing or criminal justice? Mahmood seemed to have a real faith that the justice system would be okay for him. He did have this idea.
Yeah, and that was partly because of his experiences. He had been through the criminal justice system a few times for much pettier things. The most recent, before he was arrested for the murder of Lily Volput, was he was accused of larceny and sacrilege for stealing money from the mosque, the local mosque in Newtown. And he was guilty. He was found guilty and put on probation. And then there were a few other times when he was charged, but each time found not guilty. And so I think that had given him a confidence in the system. He didn't like the police, he didn't trust the police, but he trusted the authorities beyond them, the courts, the barristers, the prosecution. He thought that they worked well. And in 1951, he'd also had experience of being a court interpreter in a trial involving a group of Somalis, local Somalis. And later on, that the same individual was involved. He was shot and killed in Tiger Bay for stealing money from someone that he was meant to be keeping money for. So all of this, they lived in a milieu where they were engaged with the authorities in various ways, in small ways and in big ways. And Mahmood spoke English pretty well. And one of the sort of charming details about him is that, most of the Somalis who arrived and many other people and many British people couldn't read or write at that time. So they would mark their name with an X. But Mahmood had learned enough literacy to be able to sign his name M. Mattan. So I think he was constantly trying to learn how to navigate in this new world that he was in. So when he was arrested for this, he thought, please, this is ridiculous. I've got nothing to do with this. And he started asking the prison doctor about the compensation he would receive for being in prison wrongly for the 2 weeks, 4 weeks that he thought this would all be concluded in. But he didn't realize that the parameters had changed. And this wasn't a petty crime. This was murder, and a shocking murder, where a woman was killed a disabled woman was killed while her family had dinner next door in the middle of a busy street. So they needed to find someone. And, you know, the fact that the family had mentioned seeing a Black man on the doorstep, again, that added fuel to this fire. The fact that the media were all over it, the family put up a reward. So again, that was kind of sensational for the time. All of it meant that they needed a conclusion. They needed a narrative. And the police were very good, and are still very good, at creating a convincing narrative. So they recreated who Mahmood was. He wasn't this father, this 20-something-year-old man, you know, making small mistakes, but also doing good things for other people. He became this villain, this no good gambling addict panther who was roaming the streets at night looking for an easy target. They found people that would verify that, who would say, yes, he was dangerous. He threatened me, he harmed me. And then they put him on trial in Swansea, not in Cardiff, but in Swansea, which was a smaller town, a much whiter town, a more traditional town, which is something, again, that you see in the US, where cases are moved to where the prosecution will find a kind of jury that the kind of jury that they want. So they found Mahmood to be the embodiment of their fears. And this went beyond anything that he'd experienced before. He had no power. All of his power had disappeared. All of his kind of streetwiseness meant nothing in this context.
Yeah. And of course, his defense attorney, his solicitor, did not help very much. No, he called him. You have the option for a public defender versus a private. Is that how the system?
So he was entitled to legal aid. So the British system was becoming a little bit more humane by this stage, not very, but a little bit more humane. So you could get legal aid. And now this is one of the things that's reversed. Now it's much harder to get legal aid. And we're getting to the stage where some people are being told to go to trial and represent themselves.
Wow.
So the 1950s, you know, in theory, should have been this really benighted, terrible time. But I think we had the inklings. We were now at the stage of having a welfare state. There was some compassion creeping into the system. And now I think the opposite is happening. The compassion is creeping out of the system. So Mahmood was offered a legal aid barrister and solicitor, but the Somalis said, no, we'll pay for his defense. And they raised money amongst themselves and paid for the defense. So this was a private, expensive barrister saying all of this in court. And it was the same guy, the same barrister who'd been in the court the previous year with the Somalis and the murder case there, and had used the exact same language of savagery and savages and semi-civilized savages. And he was, you know, appealing to what he thought would be a Welsh jury's idea of these people and what could be expected from them and what could not be expected from them. So he calls Mahmood a half child of nature, a childish liar. You know, he thinks that this will help his case.
Somehow.
Yeah. But what is surprising, I think, and you asked the question about how it's changed now, at no point is any obviously racist language used by the police against Mahmood. They never call him a savage or a semi-civilized savage. Yeah. They never use the typical racist language of that time and our time. They don't have to. It's much more subtle. And institutional racism is really subtle. Mm-hmm. It's not about the crude terms. It's about just manipulating the information to fit into stereotypes. It's about dehumanizing someone just to the degree that harm can come to them or that they can be utilized in some way. Mahmood is very defensive and aggressive with them. He says, you can keep me here all you want. You can say that I killed the king. You can say that I murdered 70 people. Doesn't make it true. And they're like, yeah, make it true. But we're still going to get you hanged. Mm-hmm. And I think that the system is still incredibly biased, more so now than it was then. So Mahmood was one of 5 Black and Asian men executed in 1952 out of 25 men altogether. So they made up 1 in 5. And now I think when you look at imprisonment at both youth level and older, the length of sentencing, the kind of people who are taken to court and the kind of people who are not, the inequalities are much starker. So Black and Asian people are probably making up 40–50% of those incarcerated.
Well, it's similar. Well, we have incredible imbalances here, as you're well aware.
Yeah,
as well. So I'd like
the death penalty, which is the terrifying thing.
Yeah. So some, that for us it's state by state, and of course then there's a federal death penalty. So if you commit a crime crossing state lines, you may be subject.
Yeah.
That, but and here in Massachusetts, where we are, we don't have a death penalty any longer. However, again, there are states that have death row, and they're pretty aggressive at
yes, yeah, and again, getting worse, not improving, but getting worse.
Yeah. So I'd love to bring a couple of questions that are here too, because again, I can talk to you all day. I know I love this book. Someone asks, did you discover anything of the Jewish family's efforts to avoid Mahmood's conviction?
No, not in that. Not, I wouldn't say in those terms. They were traumatized. They were absolutely traumatized, and I think that the whole. What I do know of what their lives looked like after the murder was they became refugees again, in a way, refugees from their own grief. Mm-hmm. So Diana, who was the surviving sister, sold up the shop, sold up most of the possessions, left Tiger Bay for another part of Cardiff, and eventually moved to Bournemouth on the English coast and died there. Her daughter moved around a lot, went to Israel for a short time, then came back to England, lived in London for a time. And when I met her a few years ago, she had moved back to Tiger Bay. So there was a circle there. And she told me when we met in Cardiff that the trauma of what had happened to her aunt had wiped her memory. Mm. So there was little that she could remember of her childhood. And she was there on the night of the murder and would have seen, the killer. She did see the killer, and she saw, the consequences of what he had done, the after effects of what he had done. So I think they were so traumatized that they just ran away from it. The one thing that they stood firm on was refusing to say that Mahmood was the man that they had seen, because it just wasn't. They knew that. Mm-hmm. I think that Diana and her daughter had seen two different men, actually, both of them Somali. And the first one was a local neighbor who I don't think had anything to do with the crime. But the second guy was a Somali tall man, a sailor. And I think maybe he had been the killer. And he ran away very quickly. He first of all went to Manchester and then to Brazil. Okay. So they had seen a Somali, they had seen a black man. That wasn't a lie. That wasn't a lie that the police manufactured. But the police decided quickly that they weren't going to find the right Somali. So any Somali will do. Yeah. And the family didn't go along with that to the degree that they could resist it. Okay. They didn't have much power. The British justice system is one that kind of clunks along without much intervention, really.
Yeah, and them not having much power. Again, going back to what the detective said to them, I'm very disappointed in you. Go back and rethink this.
Britain was and is extremely hierarchical. So when someone is above you, and they're immigrants, they are immigrants at the end of the day. And I think it was this particular detective, if not someone, one of his peers, who would have helped their father get citizenship in the first place. Mm-hmm. So there is that feeling of you owe us. Mm-hmm. We can help you. Don't make life difficult for us as an institution, as a police force. We're here to help people like you as long as you behave.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't think that that's disappeared. I don't think that mentality has disappeared.
Yeah, and that goes along with who the good immigrants are versus those who are not so good. Let's see, another question. I think we've sort of addressed this, and it was really around, how did you decide what to keep the same and what to change and add in the book? So, this is a a fictional account of a true event. So
Yeah.
another person asked about the name change between, Lily Volpert and Violet Balaki, if you wanted to address
Yes.
that.
Yeah, this was tricky because I'd had some experience of doing this with my father's life, Black Mamba Boy, which is again a semi, it's mostly true but fictionalized. And again, this is mostly true and close to the archives. And I wanted Mahmood to be as present in the novel as he could be. He's present to a degree in the archives, some of his words are there, these conversations, these intimate conversations he has with the doctor or with Laura that she reports later on. I wanted to include as much of that because then he is there, he is speaking for himself. There's the testament at the end of the novel, which is his own testament that he wrote in that cell, waiting for his execution. So it was important for me to have this dialogue with him where he speaks on his own accord and says what he wants to say. And I didn't want to police who he was. There's the question of showing him warts and all that comes up. And I thought if I try and censor him, prettify him, I'm doing him a disservice because what happened to him should never have happened. However difficult or criminal he may have been, he did not murder anyone. So, and at the end of the day, I don't think anyone should be executed, but especially not for a crime you haven't committed. And it doesn't matter if you're a difficult person or not. So the bits where I have stepped in are places where the archive recedes or becomes threadbare. And that's particularly true of Mahmood's early life. So he spoke to the prison doctor about his background, the fact that he was the youngest of 5 boys and his father had shops in Hargeisa and had some lorries, and there was a few details here and there. He mentioned being able to speak 5 different languages, so that made me think, okay, how did he learn Swahili? How did he learn Arabic? And I had fun with that. I enjoyed planning this journey. I know that he joined the Merchant Navy from Durban in South Africa. So there's this massive expanse of space and time that he traveled through. And I thought about my own father's journey and other Somali men's journey that I'm aware of and had fun with it. But in most ways, I tried to stay as true as possible to what the archive said, or what the interviews I did with people revealed.
Okay, and thank you. There's another question. Even though this story plays in 50s Cardiff, it's also a story of today in the US, where young Black men are wrongfully convicted. You've been a writer in residence at NYU in the spring of 2022, so I think you have another fan here who's following your trajectory, and interacted with students in the US. What has been an experience during this time in the US that makes you hopeful that we can today better address discrimination and injustice in US society than we have done in the past?
I remember there was one day I was in Harlem and there was a protest in the rain against something. I can't remember the exact outrage that the NYPD had committed that time, but there was a protest and it wasn't a big noisy one. It wasn't, it was after the Black Lives Matter summer where, the thousands of people would come out regularly. This was, the bulk of the people who are constantly just keeping tabs on what the police are doing. It's the day-to-day drudgery of keeping these movements alive. And they were surrounded, I think there was probably about 20 people and then 40 police officers surrounding them. But the fact that they were there doing it anyway, unafraid, that makes me hopeful, because it's that drudgery, it's that work, that constant work of keeping something alive. It makes me think of the 1920s in New York, where every time there was a lynching, they would hang flags out saying, "Today a man was lynched." It's hard work. It's the attention comes and goes, but when the attention does come, these are the people who are then, I think, in the right place to be able to garner that energy, to do something worthwhile with it. Because sometimes it can feel so exhausting when things don't seem to change between 1952 and 2022. It's exhausting, it's fatiguing, and it takes its toll on people mentally, especially when you're entering, periods of recession, of physical and material hardship. It can be difficult to keep these sorts of fights going, but they do, and that gives me hope.
Yes. So it's soldier on, keep working, right? It's
Yeah.
not an easy thing to overcome at all.
Yeah. And when I was working on The Fortune Men over the last 17 years, there were loads of times when it felt irrelevant. When, this obscure incident, this obscure case in 1952 in Cardiff felt really detached from anything in people's daily life. But then by the time it was coming out, suddenly it felt very topical again, because things haven't changed. I think it will take a lot longer for these things to substantially change than the 70 years that have passed.
Yes, absolutely. In the US, we have, like the Innocence Project, in local branches, the Exoneree Project, and you just cannot get through the number of people who have spent time in, decades. And again, this was with the suspension of the death penalty in many places, but spending decades in prison and then being released on, some of the same circumstances, a single witness who was, it's been coerced or tells the story that, no, I really never saw that person, but I was told I need to do this for X reason or whatever,
And this idea that there's a change, there was a change in the 60s, or there was a change with Obama, whatever potential cause for a change, it takes a lot more work than that, because the cultures of these institutions are built in the same way that, there's this donkey work of justice. There's also the donkey work of injustice, where people are trained by people who think this is the normal way to do things. And when that culture is so ingrained and replicated, so Mahmood Mattan's case happened in 1952. In 1989, there was another case in Tiger Bay where 3 Black men were accused of a murder they hadn't committed and spent 4 years in jail for that. And then in 2021, a Somali boy was brutalized in Cardiff police station and died the next day. So this is, again, this huge span of time. It reveals that the cultural shifts, it's not even shifts, the cultural revolutions that need to take place are not happening in the way that we want them to. Yeah.
We find another question. So here's one that kind of goes back to the time that Mattan was in prison. And the question is, why does the doctor spend so much time testing him?
Why does he spend so much time testing him? Because the British like to do things like that. They like lots of paperwork and bureaucracy. And it's very creepy, because the way that they would operate death row and the death penalty is recognizable to me. So the doctor is there to make sure that Mahmood is healthy enough to execute. It's so horrific. But first of all, they're there to check that Mahmood is sane and fit for trial. And the funny thing is that out of all of the other Somali men who were on capital cases, the others were all they were not executed. There was strong evidence against them, but they were not executed. Sometimes it's because the doctors found them to be unfit for trial beforehand, or sometimes quite magically they would be found to have not committed the crime in the right state of mind, and they'd be sent to a psychiatric hospital. But Mahmood, who was completely sane and completely innocent, was executed. And so once the trials happened, their job is to make sure he's not able to kill himself. So there was all of these routines about, your shoelace had to be of a tiny length, so you couldn't find a way of hanging yourself with your shoelace. You were kept under 24-hour supervision in the cell. You were fed, the awful the prison meals, which also had to be halal. They had to be according to your religious beliefs, traditions. And they also passed on the weight and height of the prisoner to the executioner so that they could set the gallows for the right depth, the right drop. So the way that the medical system is also part of this is eerie. And again, it's not just one element of the society that partakes in this kind of cruelty, it's all of them. And one of the prison interviews that Mahmood has, the doctor describes him as this is the language of the time, so excuse me for the language of the time, but something, he calls him a marvelous Negro with splendid teeth, something like that. So this objectified, still kind of the eugenics that were very popular in the early 20th century were still seen as standard science. Yeah. So when they look at someone like Mahmood, they're looking at him as a specimen of a type, of an African type. And some Africans were more violent, some of them were more docile, some of them were more cunning. So that's what they're also trying to work out, is who is he? And I think his barrister says, what is he? That's the question they're trying to answer. What is he? And what do we do with him?
Wow. So I want, our time is getting close, but I have a couple more questions that I want to, or areas that I want to explore with you. And one is that, we are obviously a school of public health, and public health, really the mission of public health is to work towards equity, and its core and its purity. That's what we should be doing, getting what people need to live better lives and have healthier lives. Storytelling is not always part of that. However, I'm just wondering, for our students who have read this book, that are coming through our doors, tell us something about the power of storytelling and how it can be used for good.
I think this novel has really shown me that. It's shown the strange connections that storytelling can create between people. Very early on, when the book first came out, a reader got in touch with me and said she was so touched. She was in Cardiff and she was so touched by what had happened to Mahmood Mattan that she found where his grave was and put some flowers down. And more recently, and this is to do with, I think, a whole bunch of different things, but the fact that this case has re-emerged in the media and to public attention is that the Cardiff police, the South Wales police as they are now, have finally apologized for the miscarriage of justice to Mahmood and his family. And that's taken 70 years. So I think having the book, having the case back in the newspapers creates an opportunity for these conversations to happen again, when it's easy to otherwise think that, oh, this is in the past, let sleeping dogs lie. And even for me, I think it's been a very cathartic experience. I started writing the novel after my father died, and it was partly an excuse to go back to his world of Somali sailors, of these men who reminded me of him, who sounded like him, who had lived similar lives. So I'd go to Red Sea House, which is in Cardiff, where old Somali sailors are given places to live, and they have a community centre at the bottom. Or in London, there was Mayfield House. So it felt like I was bathing back in this very familiar world that had been taken away from me through the loss of my father. And that was a way of grieving and a way of processing that grief. But yeah, I think it's hugely important, both on a personal level and on a social level. There are so many more things that we can understand or care about through a novel and the time it takes to sit with something, not just in a newspaper article or hearing something on the news, but actually the hours, the days that it takes to finish a novel that gets under the skin. And that communion, which is part of the writing process and the reading process, is something that I don't know where I'd find in anything else.
I appreciate hearing that. Within as an epidemiologist, a lot of my writing is scientific, but there is clearly room within public health to expand on the stories and the lived experiences.
Yeah, and especially when you're dealing with traumatized groups, you know, the epidemics of violence. You know, people are starting to look at violence as a type of contagious activity or behavior, and I think there is real truth in that. You know, the book I'm working on right now is looking at how people took the trauma of the Somali Civil War and carried it with them in their, you know, in their subconsciouses to London, to Toronto, all these different places where suddenly there's this violence between young men, and it doesn't make any sense. You know, the reasons that they're killing each other, fighting, doesn't make any sense unless you start factoring the things that they maybe didn't experience themselves, but have carried with them somehow.
So again, back to that intergenerational trauma. And so, you know, coming through this conversation again to Laura and her family, and her sons, the journey of 46, 47 years before having Mattan's name cleared, but the toll that it took on that family.
It was too much. It was too much to undo. Nothing could undo it. The quashing of the conviction, the compensation, which was substantial. It was a life-changing amount of money, but it made nothing. It made no difference to their lives. They all died homeless, despite having bought houses or had hundreds of thousands of pounds passed through their hands. The harm had been done. And I think it was Omar that described the knowledge of what happened to his father being like a cancerous growth in his head. And it had material effects. The loss of their father and the way that he had died, had been taken from them, had material effects. They were shunned, they were starved, they were bullied, they were attacked. One of their sons was put in the same cell as Mahmood, and the prison warders apparently taunted him, saying, "This is where we hanged your father. This is where we hanged your father."
Wow.
So they carried with them a level of trauma that nothing could really, I think, undo by the end. And they all died young, in their 40s and 50s, in their 50s actually. So and their children have also carried that trauma, because of the way that their own father's behavior was impacted by their trauma. They were traumatized. And I don't know when that stops. Grace, or Ruth, to use her real name, is the daughter of the sister of Lily, and she was traumatized. And she felt like it was really interesting to me that she felt like she had a curse, she said. And most recently, one of Mahmood Mattan's granddaughters felt as if their family was cursed, as if the name was cursed. So it goes back to these almost kind of biblical ideas of a mark being put on a family, and that's carried forward and forward.
Oh, yeah, that's a very interesting way to think about that. Yeah, that it's, you know, thinking about just from that one generation, but that it does continue on. Yeah. So, you know, again, another at the end of the narrative, it's literally as he's being executed, he has these words that aren't completely clear. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write those final words?
Sure. Yeah, that was very hard. That scene, the last few moments were very, very hard, because despite me knowing from the beginning what happens to him, the way that I wrote the novel meant that I was with him when he was free. That's the person I'd got close to. And I couldn't believe that they would do this to this man, this mobile man who'd roamed and roamed and roamed and had his whole life ahead of him. So I hated writing that scene. And there was a Welsh language book called Crogi ar Gam, which means killed in error or killed wrongly. And it was written by, was he the nephew or the son? A relative of one of the prison warders who was in with Mahmood in the execution cell. So he said he'd heard it firsthand from this man. And they described Mahmood as fighting back or fighting towards the gallows. And you know, they put these words together that were gobbledygook, you know, words that made no sense. And even when I read them, I couldn't make sense of them. But then I realized it was the Islamic prayer. And Mahmood in his last moments was doing all he could do. And he thought that what he needed to do was make his final declaration of faith so that when he dies, God knows that that's what was on his mind. So it was really painful to know that they thought he was just, talking nonsense. But I could understand the weight of what he was saying. And he was so lonely in that moment. The only person, the only entity he could reach out to was God. And they were intent on killing him. It didn't matter. It didn't matter that, that he was saying he was innocent till the last moment, that he was resisting them, that he refused to wear the suit that they were trying to make him wear, and he died in his prison pajamas. This stylish man refusing to wear, anything to make this whole ritual more dignified. It wasn't a dignified thing. It was a murder.
Yeah.
And all he could ask for was for God to be with him.
Yeah. Wow. So my last question for you before we wrap is at the end of the book, again, there was another archive newspaper, and it describes a woman who was weeping in the rain.
Woman weeps in rain.
Yeah.
That's from one of the newspapers, local Welsh newspapers, on the day that he was executed. It says, "Woman weeps as Somali is hanged." Almost within a stone's throw of the house in which he had lived in Cardiff, Mahmood Mattan was executed today for the murder of a Jewish shopkeeper at Cardiff docks. And the woman weeping is, of course, Laura, who didn't know that this execution was about to happen on the day that their eldest son was turning 4 years old. So that small snippet, which in a newspaper would quickly be thrown out, encapsulates a tragedy that will resonate in their lives for decades.
Yes. Wow. Well, again, thank you so much for bringing this character to light, to our attention. There just remains so many things that we could talk about for like another hour. This is an amazing book.
Thank you for the questions and for the audience questions as well.
Yes. Thank you for the audience chiming in. We so appreciate your time being here. And I look forward to reading your other work. And as you mentioned, you'll be swinging through Boston in the near future, and I will do my best to try to
Please do.
to bring
October 24th.
October 24th, to bring my own copy with all of my little things there for you to.
I'll be ready with my pen.
Right. So at this time, again, thank you, and I'd like to turn this over to Dean Galea.
Well, thank you, Dean Kosir, and thank you, Ms. Mohamed. As I said at the beginning, I loved reading this book, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. The only challenge is I have another 10 questions I would like to ask you. Respect the time and space, and I'll do that. Really, thank you for writing this book, bringing the story to the world, and for joining us today, for everything that you do. It really is a privilege to have hosted you today. Thank you, and good luck with your next step.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience as well. Thank you for turning up.
Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.